Good evening. Welcome to the Filson. We're here for another exciting lecture tonight. I am Stuart Goldberg. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Filson Historical Society, and we're so pleased that you're joining us for this exciting lecture tonight. And tonight, I am pleased to introduce Georgia Hunter, author of We Were the Lucky Ones. She received her BA in psychology from the University of Virginia. From a young age, her personal essays and photos have been featured in the New York Times, Why We Travel, in Travel Girl magazine, and on equitrekking.com. Sounds like a fascinating website. She is also a freelance writer in the world of adventure travel. In the year 2000, she learned the intriguing war stories of her grandfather and his family. This led her to uncovering and recording her family's history. And eventually, this became the bones of her novel, We Were the Lucky Ones. We are now about to hear the rest of the story. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Georgia Hunter.
Thank you, Stuart. That was such a nice introduction, and thank you, Scott, for all the help getting all of this set up into the Filson Historical Society. This is such a gorgeous venue, and I spent a little time walking through the exhibit that's up just next door about family stories and genealogy and artifacts, and I encourage you all to do it. It seemed like such a natural fit when I got the invitation to come speak that's the exhibit that's up now, and there's some really amazing artifacts, letters, wedding gowns, children's clothes. So go take a look, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm so honored and excited to give this talk, and I want to say a very special thanks also to Louisville. It has a very special place in my heart because my horse family is here. I have horse family all over, but my friends over there are my home away from home. When I come here, I feel like I am surrounded by the most loving people. So I've got trainers, Keith and Lisa and Alyssa, my girlfriend, another Alyssa, who I grew up riding with since I was maybe 25 years ago. I've got friends here for the second or third time, so sorry guys, there's going to be a couple new things in this talk, I promise, from Vancouver, so thank you all. I just appreciate your support so much. Thank you all for coming. I'm curious to know, has anybody read We Were the Lucky Ones? Oh, good. Wow, okay. Well, today what I thought I would do is sort of tell you a little bit of the story behind the story. As Stuart mentioned, this was a piece of my family history that I discovered a little bit later in life, in my teens. And so for as many questions as I get asked about the story itself, I often get almost more questions about the discovery process and what it was like to uncover this piece of my ancestry. So first off, in a nutshell, We Were the Lucky Ones follows my grandfather and his siblings and his parents, a family of Polish Jews, as they scatter at the start of the Second World War, sort of on this twofold mission. First, to survive, and second, to reunite. And what a lot of people find interesting about this piece of my story is that I had no idea it existed until I was 15 years old. And it's especially interesting because I lived right down the street from my grandfather. We were very, very close. This is me at age 1 with my grandfather, who's Addie in the book, by the way. If you pick up the book, chapter 1, it opens with Addie in Paris. And here we are. We lived in small town Massachusetts. We spent holidays together, birthdays, family meals. And yet, growing up, for the first 14 years of my life until he died, I had no idea he had a Polish Holocaust history. He had changed his name once he moved to the States to Eddie Kortz from Addie Kork. He had become an American through and through. Looking back, I might say there were some quirks that I could attribute to his Europeanness. He was very resourceful. He made a lot of the things in his home by hand. He wove the curtains that hung in the living room from a loom that he built by hand that lived in the basement. He had clay busts of his children that he sculpted by hand from a photograph that his brother Jacob took. He had all these funny contraptions in the bathroom to hang the soap from a magnet because he thought the soap dish was gross. It would get, slimy, so he embedded magnets into his soap. Weird, little quirky things that looking back now, I'm like, he was very resourceful. He made us speak French at the dinner table, things like that. But growing up, I never heard an accent. I was not raised Jewish. My mother was not raised Jewish. It was a piece of his past that he chose to put behind him. So it wasn't until I was in high school when an English teacher assigned our class a project called an eye search that this piece of his history came to light. He had passed away the year before, and I decided to sit down with my grandmother, Caroline, who you also meet towards the end of the book. And it was over that hour with her, and I remember vividly sitting in her home in Massachusetts, and she had this beautiful kind of shoulder-length, silky, silver hair, and she liked it when I would braid it. And so I remember sitting by the window and braiding her hair and talking and asking questions. And over the course of that hour, learning that I was a quarter Polish Jewish and that my grandfather came from this very large family of Holocaust survivors. The discovery was quite a shock, as you can imagine, but I never felt angry or resentful about it. I remember feeling just extremely curious. I had 1,000 questions, and I craved answers. And my sweet grandmother was able to answer some of them, and she was able to tell me about my grandfather's piece of the story, which was that he was the only one of his family members living in France at the start of the war. The rest were in Poland, and that somehow he managed to find a ticket on a boat leaving Marseille, due for Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. She said that he actually met a woman on that boat. She called her Elizabeth, and that they were actually engaged. So lucky for me, that did not work out. But she mentioned that there was this romance. She said once he finally got to Brazilian soil that he lost touch with the family in Poland, and for the duration of the war had no idea if he would ever see them again. And I said, well, what about that family? How did they manage to survive? I knew enough in my Holocaust studies at the time that the odds were severely against them. And she said, you know, I met your grandfather's family after the war, and like your grandfather, they rarely spoke about that time. So I'd have to wait several years for some more answers. And that happened at a family reunion that my mother organized at our home on Martha's Vineyard. And in this photograph, I'll point out my grandmother, Caroline, here, the matriarch. And if you read the book and met my grandfather's sister, Mila, and her little girl, Felicia, this is Felicia, who was 1 year old at the start of the war. I'm up here, and as you can see, cousins galore. This is just actually a portion of us. We were 32 in all. My mother is one of 10 first cousins from her father's side, and she invited them, and they all immediately agreed to come, and they showed up from France and Brazil and Israel and across the states, and it was a wild, musical, chaotic week together where lots of different kinds of food were prepared and languages being spoken, and I met cousins I'd never met before. It was incredible. And one night of that reunion, I wandered outside to where my mom's generation was sitting on the back porch and talking, and I sat down next to my aunt Kath, and I started listening, and I realized that they were telling stories about the war and about my grandfather, and that's when I first got little snippets of the greater Kirk family story. For example, Jose was there. He's one of my mother's cousins. He was born in Siberia. He at the time didn't know why his parents had been sent to Siberia in the early years of the war. He didn't know when his actual birthday was. He just knew that his mother told him he was born in the dead of winter, and it was so cold when he would wake up as a newborn that his eyes would be frozen shut, and she would coax them open with her breast milk. Another cousin, Anna, talked about how her mother, hiked over the Austrian Alps to safety after the war while pregnant. Another cousin, Victor, talked about how his parents, who had been in love since their young teenage years, once the war began, decided they couldn't wait any longer to get married. And so they found a rabbi to come out of hiding, and in a very dangerous, very illegal ceremony, were married in a little blacked-out home in Lvov to candlelight service. I heard about false IDs. I heard about a disguised circumcision. I heard about a mother-daughter escape from the ghetto. The stories kind of kept coming, and I remember sitting there thinking, oh my goodness, these stories are unbelievable. How have I never heard them before, and how has nobody taken the time to write them down? And I can't say I knew right then and there that somebody would be me, but I think that's when the idea was seeded, and I couldn't quite let it go. And it would take me another maybe 8 years before I finally got the courage to put a stake in the ground and say, okay, this is something I'm going to do. And part of the reason why I was nervous to do it was because I knew it would require a lot of travel. So this is a slide showing my research travels. I was living in Seattle at the time in 2008 when I set off for my first interview in Paris. And it was important for me to sit down with as many relatives as I possibly could. And Felicia was the first on my list. She was the only living relative with firsthand memories, but the family was everywhere. So this is a map, and my first stop, as I said, was to visit with Felicia in Paris, and here I am. My sweet husband, Robert, came with me on all of my research travels. Here we are with Felicia and her husband, Louis, in Paris, and this was an amazing couple of days. I knew this would be the most challenging of my interviews because her entire childhood was consumed with knowing nothing else but the Holocaust, being hunted, being in hiding, seeing the death and destruction around her. And yet her stories were just remarkable and vivid. And I was so grateful. I was very gentle in my approach with her, but was so grateful for how much she was willing and able to share with me. And I have a special slide that I just added yesterday, and thanks to Scott, we snuck it in here. I want to show you, I did a lot of research and finding of, outside research and finding artifacts and photos and things. I had somebody reach out to me last week from Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum and Memorial in Jerusalem, and said, I read your book, and I recognized a name in there, Felicia. She knew her as her married name. She said, I have Felicia's wartime clothing in storage. There was an exhibit that was once on display, and I almost fainted. I was like, what? I don't know if I remember the name of the display, I'll tell you. But so I said, well, how do I see them? Can you take pictures? And then the next day, I got an email from a friend from Virginia who said, hey, I'm going to be in Israel. Is there anything you need while I'm there? And I said, well, actually, are you going to Yad Vashem? And he said, I am going. And so I put him in touch with this curator, and he was so kind, and she was so kind, and they got together and took pictures. So I'm just going to show you a couple of them. So these are the clothes that Felicia wore as a little girl. And you can actually see on the right, this was her false name that she took on in the convent. She was in hiding in a convent towards the end of the war. And I just thought they were the patterns were so sweet, and I was so moved by them. So I wanted to show you guys. This is just this goes to show that this project of unearthing my ancestry will never actually be over. And things are coming up out of nowhere. So that was my first stop, was to visit with Felicia. My next stop was to Rio de Janeiro to visit with some cousins there. Here I am on the left with my mother's cousin, Michelle, and we're standing in front of the building where the relatives would have come through when they finally arrived in Brazil. And this is a bay called the Guanabara Bay on the right, where there's an important scene for my grandfather that takes place here, where he borrows a boat and paddles out to meet a ship coming in. And it was really special to stand there kind of in his footsteps and imagine what that, probably didn't look all that different, imagine what that felt like. We visited the archives. We found actually lots and lots of records at the National Archives, which thankfully my family helped me translate. And I'll come back to my decision in the end to fictionalize the book. So obviously, there was a lot of research involved. But does anybody know where this is? Copacabana. Yeah, I heard you say it. Yeah. So they were, as the stories unfolded through the second-generation survivors and through Felicia, I pieced together a timeline. So I started to figure, I kind of went into it thinking, all right, well, there'll probably be my grandfather's piece and then the Polish piece. But as soon as I got into the research, I realized, oh no, actually the family in Poland scattered too, and they all had their own paths to survival. So hence the timeline, which I color-coded by sibling and kind of tried to keep track, and eventually it took shape. And where there were a few holes I thought that were important to fill, that's where I allowed myself some creative license. For example, it turns out my grandfather, to get on that ship that left Marseille, needed a visa, but that visa that he acquired was actually illegal. It expired also when the ship was detained, first in Dakar and then in Casablanca. So when he finally arrived in Brazil, 6 months after he was meant to, with an expired visa, I felt like it was an important moment for readers, for me, and for readers to have, in the Kirk family story. What did that day entail, the first day of walking on free soil with his fiancée, with his new love? And so I didn't have that story. And so there is a scene in the book. I felt it was important, and I based that around my own experience. What I did with my husband, Robert, on our first day in Rio, which is walk around Copacabana on this beautiful Avenida Atlantica with this mosaic, which I knew existed at the time, and I knew my grandfather would have admired. And I knew, and here we are, here's Robert trying our first sip of coconut water. So that's exactly what Addie and Aliska did. Speaking of the ex-fiance, once I ran out of relatives to interview, I thought, who else might have a story to share? And thanks to the web, I was able to find, and actually thanks to a book written about the ambassador issuing those illegal visas to refugees fleeing France, fleeing Europe, I found some names listed in the back. I found my grandfather's name, and I found two names that sounded very familiar, Eliska Lobirova. My grandmother had described my grandfather's ex-fiancée as Elizabeth Lobier, and she had been traveling with her mother. And so Eliska and Gustava Lobirova were listed in the back of this book. And I found her listed in a maiden name in a church catalog in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and somehow tracked down her address, wrote her a letter the old-fashioned way, and with my phone number, and I said, I'm not sure if you remember my grandfather, but, I hope you do. I wasn't sure what mental state she'd be in, and she called me the very day the letter arrived and said, of course I remember your grandfather. I adored him. Come visit me. So my mother and I flew down to Chapel Hill and spent 2 amazing days with Eliska, and she offered this really incredible window, not just into how they managed to get out of Europe and into Brazil, but what it was like from a very human perspective, to be leaving everything and everyone behind, to be falling in love, like where they found time for privacy, to what life was like in Rio as they kind of started over. So I was so grateful. She was 88 years old and so sharp. And she also had documents. She had the photographs of my grandfather. This was her at around the age when she met my grandfather. She even had, when my grandfather first got to Brazil, before his work permit cleared, he worked at a leather book bindery, binding books, out of leather by hand. And she had 2 of his hand-bound leather books and gave us one. So it was a very, very special visit. Once I exhausted the oral history piece of my research, I then thought, okay, well, I'm sure there are some records out there, and if they are, I'm going to find them. So I, thanks to my timeline, could say, okay, if I knew if a relative was maybe in Russia at this time, or France at this time, or Poland at this time, I would just reach out to any archive, town registry, ministry, magistrate, and I'd write a letter, which often meant hiring a translator to write a letter and ask about a name. And sure enough, letters started coming back, records started coming back. So this one came back 11 months after I had sent it from the Ministry of Moscow, and they had a name and a date. Yes, we have record of your great-uncle Ginnick. And even if it was just that, he was here, he signed his name on this document on this date, it was like a little piece of gold, and I would drop that into my timeline. This was an incredible find through the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. I'm still unclear about why they have this, why they have such a deep World War II database of records, but I found a 9-page handwritten account of my great-uncle Ginnick's. In it, this is my grandfather's older brother that was sent off to Siberia, and in it he describes the day he was arrested in Lvov, why he was arrested in Lvov, where he and his wife Herta were sent in Siberia, the name of the camp, what they were forced to do, the day they were finally granted amnesty, and then what the year-long exodus entailed to then join the army, which was his only choice at the time, moving forward. So this was a really, really remarkable find because it helped fill a very big gap in Ginnick's storyline. And it was really special to be able to hand this over to his 2 sons. And thanks to those relatives who joined the army, I was able to find army records. And the Polish army ended up falling under the wing of the British army. So through the UK Ministry of Defense, I found out exactly where they fought, that they had fought in the Battle of Monte Cassino, which was apparently a very pivotal battle at the end of the war in Italy, and that they had unclaimed medals of honor. And so was actually able to claim those medals and return those to the family members. I also had access to some Shoah interviews. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but Steven Spielberg's initiative, the Shoah Foundation, put survivors in front of video cameras. So I got some hefty VHS tapes, which I was able to watch, and that was probably the most specific and special find, because I could see firsthand relatives talking about their experiences. So I had 3 Shoah interviews that I was able to use to help fill some gaps. So then my decision came to, okay, I've got my timeline, I've got the bones of my story, how do I bring it to life? How do I write it in a way that is going to feel relevant and visceral and not like a piece of history? And it was important for me. I had a child halfway through this process, and I knew someday he would read the book, and I wanted him to be able to read it and relate in a way, kind of step into the shoes of his great-grandfather and his siblings and experience it as if he was there. And so as I started writing, I constantly had to reconcile the images I had in my mind. For example, I had this photograph of my grandfather during his very short stint in a Polish column of the French army. I had his sheet music. If you read the book, there's a piece called Liszt that was sung by Vera Gran that made him a little bit famous. He was a composer. I had this picture of the boat where he met Aliska, the boat that never actually made it to Brazil. I have this false ID of Helena's. I love this picture because you can see this is the Polish name they chose, Brzoza. Her husband Adam made false IDs for the family, and I'm certain that this ID has kept her alive on many, many occasions. I had this photograph of Jacobs. This was after the war. He and his wife, Bella, and their baby Victor here are boarding this train to head from Poland into Germany to Stuttgart to a displaced persons camp where they're hoping they could get a visa and eventually find their way to the States. So if I had a photograph, a piece of music, a document, I knew that was going to live verbatim in the book, but I also had to reconcile this sort of dark, sepia-toned, black and white imagery I had in my head, and even just the statistics I had in my head. We all have in our heads when we look back at the Holocaust in this time, and it's almost unfathomable, right, to wrap your head around these numbers, and you think about it. I mean, the town where my family was from was once home to 30,000 Jews who made up a third of the population. After the war, there were fewer than 300 survivors. So that alone, that statistic, this is actually my last photo I'll show you, is of the ghetto gates to the town where my family is from in Rodham. And I had to remind myself constantly that even though we look back with the perspective we have now, and it's a very dark time, a very dark chapter, the family was living it in color, right? They were living, breathing, they were feeling, and I wanted to infuse that very human, very colorful dimension into the book. So that's why, in the end, I allowed myself the creative license to fictionalize. And I'll read a couple of short passages in a few minutes that kind of give you an example of how exactly I did that. And the last piece of my research was to travel in the footsteps of the family through Eastern Europe. I really wanted to see the town where they were from. Nobody went back. Once the family had left and survived, they had no interest in going back. And so that was also a bit of a scary thought for me, was what is it going to be like to arrive in this town? I mean, this was the image I had, that and the statistics. And so my husband and I went a couple years ago, and I'm going to show you this very same street corner and what it looks like today. This is Rodham, Poland, central Rodham. As you can see, it's beautiful. And so my first impression was I was struck by how quaint and livable and beautiful this little city was. There were wrought iron balconies and street lamps and flowers, and I felt welcome and comfortable. And for the first time, I could see and understand why my great-grandparents, Saul and Nechuma, had decided to live there. And that made sense to me. It didn't feel all that different from my little town in Connecticut. This was me at their address. This is the entrance to their building. They lived up on the second floor, so I did a lot of hanging around and walking in and out and in and out and in and out. People thought I was pretty strange. But I could just imagine them doing the same thing, and it was very, very grounding to be there in the place where I knew they had spent so much of their lives. At the same time, it was haunting because I did have some imagery. Like, this was a rendering of the old synagogue that was once in the center of the town, and today is an empty square. And we had a guide, a wonderful gentleman named Jacob, actually, who took us around, and he explained that the synagogue was first occupied by the Nazis, turned it into a stable, and then burned it to the ground. And today, this is what they have not filled the space. This is sort of what remains. And I also had this image of the old Jewish cemetery outside of town, and our guide really wanted to show us, the before and after. As you can see, it was beautiful, prolific. There are these ornate engravings and well-kept, and today there are barely any headstones remaining. It's very sparse, and again, Jacob explained that during the war, the Nazis came and ripped up the headstones to build an airstrip outside of town. So I had this very double experience of, I understand, I can visualize what life was like before, and I tried to write that into some of the early chapters so you could get a sense of pre-war, life for this family. But then I also had a very sort of chilling, haunting experience at the same time. But we continued our trip through Czech Republic and Austria. I did not hike the Alps that Helena hiked over, but we looked at them. And then the following summer, we came back and we took our son, who was 4 at the time, Wyatt, and we did the Adriatic coast of Italy, which was sort of the last leg of the European exodus, and was less research intense, but we did make a few important stops. And without giving too much away, there was a very important gathering in Bari at the train station. And so this is us walking up and down and being there on the platform and hearing the chirp of Italian and watching the trains come and go and imagining Mila there with little Felicia was very moving. So I'll end with a couple of passages, and I'm going to, for my amazing friends who this is like their second or third reading, I love you. These are new, so this is something you haven't heard before. So this first passage is kind of exemplifies how I took a family story and fictionalized it. So from Felicia, in that first interview in 2008, she had told me that when the family was confined to the ghetto, as the weeks and months passed, she realized at one point there were fewer and fewer children. It was unsafe for Felicia to be in the ghetto. She spent weeks and weeks devising a plan to escape. And that plan involved sewing a coat to look like a German wife who would come to the ghetto gates at the end of the day to meet their German guards, husbands. And she wanted to sew a coat so she could kind of blend in with the German wives and walk backwards out of the gates. So that's all I got. That's the story from Felicia. I knew there would need to be a lot of backstory. How did she find the material? What was it like to be sewing? And I have some scenes where she and her mother are actually sewing that coat together. What was it like to leave her parents behind in the ghetto? So from Felicia's maybe 4 or 5 sentence description, this is the very end of that scene, that chapter that describes their escape. This is Mila's perspective, told from her perspective. It's April of 1942. And they've made it from their apartment to the gates. And in the meantime, they have the Jews were required to wear stars. She's taken her star off in an attempt to blend in. So this is sort of the moment of truth. Finally, Mila senses a structure overhead. They are beneath the main entrance, the arched vehicle gate. A gust of wind lashes at their backs, and Mila reaches for her hat to keep it from blowing away. She tugs its brim low over her brow and glances down at Felicia, who is white in the face but whose expression is remarkably calm. Stay focused, Mila reminds herself. You're so close. Count your steps. 1, 2. They creep backward. 3, 4. On her 5th step, Mila can see the outer walls of the entrance and the sign that reads, "Danger of contagious diseases, entry forbidden." She can hardly believe it. They've made it outside the ghetto walls. But these next few steps, she realizes, are the most important. This is the moment she'd replayed in her mind over and over again like a scene out of a movie until she convinced herself her plan could work. Summoning the last ounce of her courage supply, Mila inhales sharply. This is it. "Come," she whispers. She swivels 180 degrees, pulling Felicia with her. And then, with the ghetto behind them, they walk. Right, left, slowly, not too fast, Mila thinks, resisting the instinct to run. Right, left, right, left. She tries to pull her shoulders back, to carry her chin high, but her heart is a jackhammer, her stomach a ball of barbed wire. She waits for the shouts, the gunshots. Instead, though, all she can hear is the sound of their footfall. Felicia's 3 steps for her too, the heels of their shoes clicking lightly on the pavement of Lubelska Street, moving slightly faster now, away from the guards and their wives, away from the workshop and the filthy streets and the so-called contagious diseases. Mila makes her first right onto Romolada Trugata, and they walk in silence for another 6 blocks before ducking into an empty alleyway. There, in the shadows, Mila's heart begins to slow. The muscles in her neck loosen. In a moment, once she's gathered herself, she'll make her way back to Warzaska Street and her parents' old building, where she'll knock on the door of their neighbors and friends, the Sobzaks, and if they'll let her, spend the night. Tomorrow, she'll use her false ID to try to arrange travel to Warsaw. They are far from safe. If they're caught, they'll be killed, but they've escaped the prison of the ghetto. Her plan, the first phase of it at least, has worked. You can do this, Mila tells herself. She glances behind her to be sure she hasn't been followed, and then stops and bends down to cup a palm around Felicia's cheek and presses her lips to her daughter's forehead. Good girl, she whispers. Good girl. So as you can see, I added a lot of detail that wasn't passed down to me, but that I thought I tried so hard to put myself in Mila's shoes and imagine not just the scenery, but what did it feel like, sound like, what was going through her mind at that very moment. So that's one example of kind of my way of turning fact to fiction. And in the end, maybe, and brought the story closer to the truth than the way Felicia told it to me, in that sort of distanced black and white way. And I'll read one more to you, and this is told from Genik's perspective. Again, he's my grandfather's older brother. And so this was a mix. I didn't get this story passed down through relatives, but I read firsthand accounts of many of the soldiers who joined Anders' army, ex-Siberian Gulag prisoners, and I read about how they were all involved in, many of them, the Polish Second Corps, were involved in this Battle of Monte Cassino, which I mentioned, which there had been 3 failed attempts in this battle. They're in Italy, southern Italy, and for whatever reason, the Polish army has been chosen to kind of lead the way, to take the casino, to get to the top of the mountain. And if they were able to win, this would pave the way to Allied victory. But I didn't know what Genik what would he have been thinking and feeling like as he's going off into this battle. No one in the family had a very strong military instinct or perspective. I knew he didn't probably want to be there. Being in the army was his only choice. But now he's there, he's proud, he's scared. So this was a way for me I had this picture of Genik with his wife Herta, and I have one other picture of a bear that ended up joining the Polish Second Corps somewhere in Iran along the way. And I was just so in love with this bear, he became a mascot for the army, that I knew I wanted to combine these two. And I created a scene where Genik is about to get mobilized to fight in this battle, and he decides to write Herta a letter. Genik listens to the drum of raindrops on the A-frame of his tent, thinking of the weekend in the mountains when he first laid eyes on Herta. He pictures himself in his white cable-knit sweater and English tweed pants, Herta close by his side in her smart goose-down ski jacket, her cheeks pink from the cold, her hair freshly washed and smelling of lavender. How surreal it felt now, looking back at it, as if he'd dreamt it. Despite the rain, he continues, morale here is surprisingly high. Even Wojciech seems to be in good spirits, lumbering happily around camp in search of handouts. You should see how big he's grown. Private Wojciech, the only official 4-legged member of Anders' army, is a bear. He was discovered in Iran as an orphaned cub. Wojciech, Polish for smiling warrior, is now the unofficial mascot for the Polish Second Corps. He's traveled with the army from Iran through Iraq, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, and finally to Italy. Along the way, he's learned to haul ammunition and to salute when greeted. He enjoys a good boxing match, and he nods in approval when rewarded with a bottle of beer or a cigarette, both of which he eagerly devours. Understandably so, Wojciech is easily the most popular member of the Polish Second Corps. Genik rolls onto his stomach, reads what he's written. Will his wife see through it? Herta knows him well enough to sense when he's hiding something. He flips to the back of his book and retrieves a photo. In it, Herta, perched on a low stone wall in Tel Aviv, wears a new gray-collared dress. He's standing beside her in his army attire. He remembers when Otto took the picture. Julia had held José while Otto counted to 3, and just before he snapped the picture, Herta had looped her arm through Genik's, leaned into him, and flipped her toe playfully like a schoolgirl on a date. He misses her more than he knew was humanly possible. José, too. I'm not sure when I'll be able to write next. We'll be restationed soon. I'll be in touch as soon as I can. Please don't worry. Of course Herta will worry, Genick thinks, regretting his word choice. He's worried, petrified. He chews the end of his pen. 3 failures, an army of ex-prisoners. The odds aren't in the Polish Second Corps' favor. How are you, he concludes. How is Zay? Reply soon. I love you and miss you more than you can imagine. Yours, Genick. So in this case, I had those 2 photographs, and I had on my timeline, I knew where he was. I knew that it had been raining a lot in Italy and that he'd been in these A-frame tents. And there were a lot of other accounts from other survivors that I read describing the weeks building up to this big battle. And so I took those, those pieces and pulled them together into that scene. And I think both of those are also kind of examples of how I tried to balance in the book the lighter moments with the dark, finding the balance between the treacherous, horrible things that were going on around this family with the sentiments of love, with the music, with the babies that were being born, and find the right sort of those tender moments to include amidst the uncertainty. So on that note, I'd love to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you. Anybody?
Don't be shy.
No, don't be shy.
Yes.
You have one? Okay.
How long, so when you started to when you finished, right, okay. How long did it take you from when you started to when you finished, and then when you wrote the book, when you actually sat down to write it, did it take you?
I mean, so it was published in 2017, and I set off in 2008 for my first interview. So 9 years start to finish. And when I'd first go off on these interviews, often I'd come back and just dash out a scene or a chapter when it was fresh in my mind. So when I finally got my timeline complete and realized I wanted to make some sort of manuscript out of it, I had like 20 one-off chapters, and I realized that wasn't going to work. I needed to write a outline and some chapter summaries, because as you can tell, the story follows a lot of people and over a lot of geography. It's 5 continents, 7 years. So then the real writing came in probably like 3 or 4 years ago, and then the editing, a couple years of editing. So yeah, long process. Almost a decade.
It was worth it. So
it was worth it, every minute. It never felt like a chore. It just always felt like something I needed to do. I was so grateful to be able to do it. Yeah. Did you have a question?
I'm curious about, is it a quote from a member of the family or a general summary of your experience? Or lucky is an interesting word.
It is, I know. And if I asked my family the question, were they lucky? And it was always yes, but. There was always a plan. They were always trying to stay one step ahead. And often I think personally that the luck came in. They were making those last-minute, split-second decisions that could have turned out either way. And I think that's where the luck came in. But they always had a plan. And yes, the title is a direct quote from Felicia, from that family reunion when we were sitting around the table, and my mother's generation, Felicia's generation, they were telling stories. At the end of the night, she spoke up and said, it's really a miracle that we are all here today. We shouldn't all be here. We were the lucky ones. So obviously that stayed with me. Yeah. Something in the back.
What happened that your grandfather did not marry the first fiance?
Oh, you're going to have to read the book. No,
I will.
The way Eliska described it was there were too many fireworks. So they were both very strong personalitied. And I had to read a little bit into it. So she gave me a stack of letters that she wrote home to one of her best friends in Czechoslovakia. And I could kind of draw from those letters a little bit of a sense of not self-centeredness, but she, I don't think, was probably able to relate to my grandfather having lost touch with his family in a way that he needed. So part of that is fictionalized, and part of it is I could read through her letters, and there were a few mentions of my grandfather kind of being in a down place, a sad place. So in the book, I kind of use that as a reason. Her mother also really was anti my grandfather until they broke up, and then she was best friends with him. But no, I think that they ended on a positive note. I was a little nervous to sit with her because I didn't really know how it ended, and thankfully they were friends after, and even with my grandmother, because he met my grandmother in Brazil, and they all were together in the city in Rio for a while. So, yes. Oh, sorry, you have a mic back there.
Yeah, couple things. I'm curious about the balance between fiction and nonfiction. I mean, this almost sounds more like what some people might call creative nonfiction than a novel. And so, how much of it, how would you balance those? And did you actually make up things that had nothing to do with any basis in historical facts? So that's one part. And then the other part is maybe just a little bit nosy, but somebody who's done some family research. All this sounds the translation sounds very pricey. And so I'm wondering if you got any advances or grants or anything like that to support it.
Yeah, so really, I'd say 99% of the narrative, who was where and when, is based on truth. So I was lucky in that way. I had my plot. I had my bones, the bones of the story. So the fictionalization came in more when I had to take a very sort of distant explanation. Even in the Shoah interviews, family members talking about their own experiences, they would talk about it with such stoicism and in a way that felt very black and white. Well, then I was crawling across a field on my hands and knees, and I heard a gunshot, but I kept going because I had to reach Jacob. And then my mother stuffed me into a mattress and dropped me out of the window of the ghetto. It's told like that. When you stop and you put yourself in the shoes of those people in that moment, there's a lot more going on. There's there's fear, there's anxiety, there's sweat dripping down your brow, there's the smell of the earth under you. So I wanted to include all those sensory details, and that's the piece that was fictionalized. Occasionally, I would create a secondary character. For example, when Mila, my grandfather's older sister, decides to put Felicia in a convent, I didn't know how she'd heard about the convent. So I had that question mark. And then there was a scene that I wanted to include that was passed down, a story where Mila was working for a German family under her false papers, her false ID, and at one point the wife of this house accused her of being Jewish and actually threw a vase at her and hit her in the head. So I knew those two things, that Felicia went off to a convent, she got hit in the head, so I decided to create a seamstress. And the seamstress was the link. So I said one day the seamstress overheard Mila mentioned that she needed a place for her daughter. The seamstress was also Jewish, working with false papers. And the seamstress tells Mila about the convent. Mila, who is also taking care of this German child, goes to visit the seamstress and then comes back, and the child tells his mom, "Mom, we went to this address." The mom gets mad, throws the vase, accuses her of being Jewish. So there were occasions like that where I felt like I needed a link from one event to the next, and I would create a secondary character. But very few of those occasions. And yes, it was very pricey, the travel. However, I stayed with family everywhere I went, which was amazing. And often that was our summer vacation. So instead of, dipping our toes in the sand in Mexico, we trekked across Eastern Europe. We kind of sacrificed our big summer vacations for that purpose. And I give my husband so much credit for that, because I didn't want to impose that on him necessarily, but he said, "No, we're doing this. We're going to go." And it was amazing. I don't regret any of it. But I certainly think that if anybody's interested in doing the same thing, it's worth looking for a grant, because I think that could be a great idea and accessible. Yeah.
My question is about your heritage, your Jewish heritage, and going through your family traditions and ancestry. Did producing this book give you a deeper sense of what it was to be and what it is to be as a part of your heritage in the Jewish faith tradition?
It did. I do think it did, because clearly I had no idea that piece of me existed. And interestingly, I just did 23andMe, and I'm a third Jewish, not a quarter, so a third Ashkenazi Jew. So I definitely feel closer to that piece of my heritage, having spent so much time researching the traditions. And I have to say, I do, it may not be so much the faith that I feel as connected to, because I wasn't brought up with that faith. It's more those traits that I think were passed down kind of quietly through my grandfather, that resourcefulness, that, ability to think, well, there's not really anything out there I can't do. If I want to do it, I want to write a book, it might take 9 years, I'm going to do it. You fall down, you dust yourself off and get back up, right, Keith? So I think it was those traits, and I see them now so clearly in the family and in my kids, my mom and her siblings, and then in my kids, and that's really special. And it's just been like the feedback I've gotten from also other family. It's interesting. My grandfather was the only sibling who didn't keep the Jewish faith. Everyone else in the family today is still Jewish, so it's a little ironic, I think, that I'm the one that chose to write this book, but maybe there's a reason for that.
You said your grandfather never spoke of it. Did you find that the European cousins, were their parents more free with the stories? Was this sort of an oral history from their parents, or just hearsay?
So my grandfather didn't speak as much about it, and he ended up in the States. My grandmother was a Presbyterian from South Carolina. Not that she wouldn't have raised the kids Jewish or been open to discussing, that piece of his heritage, but he landed also in a small town in Massachusetts where there were no Poles, no Jews, and he just wanted to assimilate and put that piece behind him. The other family lived together, so a lot of them, many generations under one roof, great-grandparents, grandparents, children. So they were in Brazil, and I think just thanks to that alone, being together in the same house, in the same city, I think the stories and the traditions and the religion, it was easier for them. But there was still, it wasn't like it was a big piece of everybody's upbringing. I kind of had to pull bits and pieces of stories out of everybody. Everybody kind of knew little bits of their own story, and then I kind of had to pull them all together. But it wasn't I just don't think it was a piece of their past that any of them dwelled on, any of the siblings.
Okay, anyone else?
You kind of answered this question, but I'm Polish descent. And when I asked my grandfather if he had any interest going back to Poland, he said absolutely not, that this was his country. And yet, his family, friends, family, the immediate family were there. So my question was, I got the sense that your grandfather had no desire to go back to the old country whatsoever, and that his assimilation was here in the United States.
Correct.
And that's the way my grandfather was. Now, interesting, my son wants to go visit Poland and go to Sandomierz and Krakow and all where they were from.
Have you been back?
No, I haven't, but I'm being pulled there. And the other question I had is that I noticed with the Polish family, depending on which side of Poland you were on, there was intense feelings against the Russians, if you're on that side, and if you're on the Germany side, there were intense feelings against Germans, and did you see the same thing?
Yeah, but the family ended up on both sides. So some were on the Russian side, some were on the German side, and the feelings were intense, for sure. But I back to your first point, I think it's sort of interesting how often it skips a generation. So there are a lot of grandchildren of survivors doing what I'm doing. And maybe it's because there's enough distance, and maybe it's because that generation of survivors are fewer and fewer, and those stories, once they're lost, are lost forever. But there are many, many authors writing about their grandparents' experiences, and I just think that's an interesting phenomenon. I do encourage you to go back. I do have family in Krakow. If you have family in Krakow, definitely, or had, that probably is one of my favorite cities. I was so surprised to find. No, yeah, but also do the concentration camps, because I think that's also so important. I want to make that like required travel for everybody. But I definitely think it was it was very grounding experience to go back, and it's surreal in a way to walk in your ancestors' footsteps, but also it's just, I can't even describe the feeling. You just kind of feel like it makes sense. You're there, and you look around, you're like, wow, this is where I came from, and it's really neat.
I have a question.
One more question.
Oh. I just want to go back to the idea of lucky again.
Where are we?
Over here.
Oh, hi. Sorry.
On the idea of lucky again, it struck me as I read it, their family had assets that other people didn't have. Mm-hmm. They were wealthier, seemed educated. How much do you think that played into the fact that they survived?
I think it was certainly played a role. Education was paramount in the household. They spoke multiple languages, and then they were able to learn languages easily. So when they ended up on the Russian side or the German side, they could pick up those languages, which also I think saved their lives. And my mother tells me that my grandfather, actually at one point when she was also made to speak French around the dinner table, he said, French saved my life one day, and way back when. He kind of left it at that. But I do think the ability to speak those languages, and yes, they were able to hide away some of their silver and porcelain and use it for bribes. So they were very lucky that way. And before the war, they were assimilated also into the Polish. It was like the Poles and the Jews. There was the Jewish quarter, but they lived in an area which was more mixed. So they went to school with Poles. They were, they didn't go to only the Jewish schools. So I think that also maybe helped them in a way. They had connections and friends and neighbors who they could rely on for help.
Yeah, it just kind of struck me that things that seem like, oh my gosh, this is so terrible that this is happening, in the end, it saved them. So, for example, because they had a nicer apartment, they were sent away to, and when other people got to, I can't remember the word, what's it called? The ghetto, yes.
The ghetto,
thank you.
yeah.
When they got to the ghetto, they were sent there first, so they had an apartment to go into. Mm-hmm. But people who came in later didn't have a place, and those were the people who were killed first. So what seemed to be something that was awful in the beginning was a blessing in disguise, perhaps.
Yeah,
and it
perhaps.
seemed like there were a lot of those kind of things that happened. Not a blessing, but maybe blessed more than the people who didn't have a home